Welcome to another edition of the Expanding on Consciousness podcast. I am Mark Zerto, and it's with great pleasure that I present the following 5-part conversation I had with physicist and author Tom Campbell. That's right, I said 5 parts. What was to be a 90-minute conversation turned into an almost 5-hour conversation between what sounds like 2 friends reconnecting after a very long separation. Although I only met Tom once before in my life and had very little time to chat with him on a personal level, apparently he and I shared so much in common that we spent an entire afternoon via Zoom just chatting about all things consciousness. For me, it was a wonderful way to spend a great afternoon, and I hope you'll find it fascinating. He is a brilliant man who many of you know through his books, and in this series, you're going to hear quite a lot of expansion on his big theory of everything, in addition to what he's been working on over COVID. I even had the opportunity to ask him some of the questions that I know so many of you have after reading his books, questions that I had gathered through social media just prior to the interview, in an attempt to make you, the audience, a part of this conversation about consciousness. Those of you who are fans of Tom's writings know something of his history before he published his theory. He and I shared a relationship with Monroe Institute's founder, Robert Monroe. And in this first episode of the 5-part series, you're in for a treat because if you want to know more about the early days of the Monroe Institute and the explorer author, Tom Campbell, you're going to learn quite a lot. Listening back to this edit, I found it to be something akin to like 2 old guys sitting in a local pub just sharing stories about the old days. It made me laugh quite a lot. So if you want to know more about the early days of psi research, the out-of-body experience, Western metaphysics, get to know more about Bob Monroe, Tom Campbell, even a little bit more about Mark Zerto, the Monroe Institute, and how Tom came to his big toe, this episode is for you. The following 3 episodes, Tom and I focus on the nature of reality and his theory. He and I really got a chance to go deeply down the rabbit hole in these episodes, and we had a lot of laughs doing so. So without further delay, here's episode 1 of my 5-hour conversation with the amazing Tom Campbell. Hope you enjoy it. My guest today is Tom Campbell. Tom is a former NASA physicist with a PhD in experimental nuclear physics. He is also the author of 3 books called My Big Theory of Everything, or My Big Toe, which is an acronym, which unifies science, philosophy, physics, metaphysics, mind, matter, and psi. A lot of topics you cover there, all in an attempt to create a paradigm of thought about the nature of reality, how it relates to consciousness, and the part that we play in this thing we call reality. Tom, it's great to have you here. Thanks for being a part of the conversation.
Well, thank you, Mark, for inviting me.
Pleasure's all mine. You've written a very popular trilogy. You have a lot of fans of your theory, and a lot of people have come to know your work. And so let's start this conversation off with how you came to this theory. My understanding is that you were in graduate school when this idea began to unfold for you, and at the time you were actually studying meditation, which eventually led you to meet our mutual old friend Bob Monroe. So let's start there. Tell the audience how you came to meet Bob Monroe and what your impressions of Bob were.
Well, okay. Yes, I did. I did really start down this path. Well, I first started down this path when I was like 6, 7, 8 years old. You know,
Wow.
I started at a very young age, and I was met by non-physical entities as I was laying in bed, not quite asleep yet, and some entities show up, and they took me out of body.
So you had your first out-of-body experience at like 6, 7 years old?
Yeah, right. That was the first out-of-bodies. And they came then almost every night for the next couple of months, I guess. And eventually they taught me how to get out myself.
Mm-hmm.
But they put me in somewhat what I would call like a training course, you know,
Right.
Not only about getting out of body, but what to do with it, you know, how to make things happen or make things not happen, you know, what you can do, where you can go. Gave me a lot of tests on what was important and what wasn't, that kind of thing. So it was kind of a training course, and it was interesting in that when I was in this reality, I was like 7 years old. But when I was in the out-of-body reality, I was like 20-something. I was more of an adult then, not a child. Yeah.
Right. So you were time traveling in a sense.
Well, yeah, I guess you could say time traveling, but I think in the non-physical, I just had a lot more cognizance of who I was and who I had been and whatever. I was more whole there than I was with a limited understanding of a 7-year-old.
Right.
So it just kind of blossomed. And I know I went back and forth a few times just observing the transition, about how that I had a much broader sense of things going on when I was in the out of body. And then I'd come back in and I could just feel the reality is just kind of sliding back down into a 7-year-old's viewpoint. And eventually, when that had run its course, I was kind of locked in. And I was told that it would not be good for me to grow up and be so strange, be so weird, that would probably, not lead to good things happening, and that they would lock that door until later, and when it would be opened again. Mm-hmm. And that later, when it was opening again, was after I met Bob Monroe. So that's what ties it all together.
We're going to have to pause there because now I have 100 other questions. That is such an incredibly integral experience for a young child to have. First of all, I mean, a lot of kids have out-of-body experiences. Mm-hmm. That's not an unusual phenomenon. What was really unusual about what I heard in your story was that you were older in this non-physical state. I assume you had this experience with the intellect of an adult, even though in the physical reality, you were a child. You were guided to not grow up and be weird. So there was a flavor of integration. I'm assuming that these non-physical entities were guides of yours?
Well, yes, that would be a good way to say it. I'm still very interactive with one of them.
I see.
And that was kind of the main character. So this was part of I should say a plan or a script that was written probably before I was born. At least this is my sense of it. Of course, one sense of it is not necessarily truth. It's just the way it seems to me.
It's right, the way it's unfolded in your understanding. So the obvious question I have now for you is, what is your sense of who these guides are?
No. I had been kind of in training, if you will, for several lifetimes before this one. And basically it was toward a goal that's still unraveling. And this was just getting me back up to speed, if you will.
Yeah.
Kind of reinitiated, back up to speed, more aware in the non-physical, bigger pictures, understanding, that sort of thing.
You see them as aspects of yourself?
So they came, well, no, they're not aspects of myself. They're different entities than me, but entities that I've worked with before.
I see. Okay.
Not just something new I picked up, but entities that we go back, lifetimes. And they, this one in particular, has had a physical body, but a long, long time ago. So not physical for a long time. And matter of fact, I guess this is kind of jumping ahead with terminology we haven't uncovered yet, but the one of them actually turned out to be the what I call the big G's. Yeah. So anyway, I use these terms like the big G's just so people don't take it too seriously. I don't want people to turn what I'm doing into theology.
Right.
So I try to keep the words light and with humor to prevent people from getting over serious and making theology out of it.
Right.
So in any case, so this is an entity that basically a reawakening for me. And it started when I was about 7, just to familiarize myself with with reality again.
Right.
Kind of a priming of the pump, if you will.
Yes.
And I came into this world very right-brained, very intuitive, holistic in my approaches and thinking. But I knew that for what it is I needed to do here, but for some reason I was kind of pushed or driven toward becoming more left-brain. Becoming, I knew I needed to be in science. It had to be math and science. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do in math and science and technology and that sort of thing, but a more technical bent, which was not where I was at all. I was very right-brained and not down that path, but that's where I needed to go. So I had to develop that left brain logical process side of me in this particular lifetime. So I went through, after 7 or 8, I don't know, that thing with out of body as a child probably went on for the best part of a year because there was a lot of training. They got me out. Of course, my first experiences out was just like, wow, what's this? You float and drift through the wall, and then, oh wow, I can fly.
I'm Superman, right?
Yeah, and some of that was probably me at about 8, 7, maybe 7 years old. But that very quickly, grew up.
Right.
That's kind of where it started for the very first time. But then after that, it was more serious, and these entities and I would have conversations, and they'd explain things to me, and then I'd go practice trying to use my intent to control the reality that I was in. So I would have exercises to do, things that I had to master with my intent in order to keep my intent focused and steady and low noise and that sort of thing. So my mind wasn't zipping around. And to do that, you couldn't be 7 years old because a 7-year-old's mind is flying all over the place most of the time. So I needed discipline and that sort of thing, which is why I was more young adult in this out-of-body state after a while because I was learning all these things. So the maturity kind of came quickly in that state. So there I am then. I go off to college. I become a physics major and go to graduate school, get a master's degree, and go to another graduate school, work on a PhD. And I ran into transcendental meditation just quite by accident.
Right.
I saw a poster on the physics department door, and it promised that I could get by with less sleep if I learned how to meditate.
Right.
And for a graduate student in nuclear physics, we're very dependent on big machines, big complicated machines. This was a big 5.5 MeV electrostatic generator. And when they work, and you collect data. And when they don't work, you spend the next week trying to make them work again, because they're very complicated things. And this one was fairly old. So when you were doing an experiment, you were scheduled. You and me and 10 other graduate students were scheduled to have time on the machine. And if you got it working and you were taking data, you didn't stop because it was midnight. You just kept taking data.
Right.
So you might be up for 2 or 3 days in a row, taking data, and you get goofier and goofier. The more time you spend awake. But you had to be sharp. So I was really looking for tools in which I could grab some deep relaxation in a very short amount of time.
Right.
And meditation seemed like it would be something that might fill that bill. So I, signed up for transcendental meditation. There was a special on for students. It was only $25. Now it's like $2,000 or something, but it was only $25 then for students. So meditation was a natural for me. It was just very easy. The very first time I sat down, I thought maybe 15 minutes had gone by and found out it was more like an hour. And it's like, where did that time go?
Right.
What happened? And from then on, it just got weirder and stranger and more fun. So I played with the meditation because I'm a scientist now. I want to understand, how things work. And I found out that I could debug my code that I was writing for my physics, work in my mind much faster and much better than I could actually looking at the printout.
Right.
I'd scroll by, and the stuff that was bad had turned red. It was like a red line, and I'd look at the line. I wrote all the lines, so I was familiar with every line of code. And indeed, that had errors in it, and I could find the errors. And it's like, wow, because in those days, debugging was a much bigger part of the process, probably the biggest part of the process. Now that we have debuggers that are all automated, and it wasn't like that then.
Right.
Debugging was very serious because you only got maybe
and all.
Punch cards. Right. You got maybe one run a week.
Right.
On the university's computer, which took up an entire building and probably was weaker than your cell phone is today.
The good old days.
And all these people were sharing this thing, so you'd get in the queue, and maybe a week would go by, and you'd get one run. And all the debug, there was no debugging. It just said your job didn't run. That's all. You just got your card deck back, and with a notice that it never finished.
Right.
So that was the extent of the debug in those days. So anyhow, I learned then that I could do this with my mind. And that was really big for me. Here I'm a physicist, and I'm thinking that the way the world works is that if you can't measure it, if you can't interact with it, if you can't, if you don't have a physical interaction with it, then it's either doesn't exist or it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
Right.
The only thing in reality that's relevant are the things that you can measure, that you can interact with.
The mind of a scientist, right?
Yeah, that's the way a scientist thinks.
Right, sure.
That was what a physicist would think about reality. So here I was debugging code, though, in consciousness. And it was working. I really was finding the errors that I would have taken me weeks to find without the meditation. So that was a big thing, and kind of changed my whole attitude toward reality, in that I now knew that there was another part of reality that was beyond measurement. It was all mental. It was all consciousness.
Right.
That there was something that you could do there that was interactive with this reality.
Right.
So it was real, but it didn't have any physical, causality. There was no physical causality
Nothing
involved.
You could measure anyway.
Right. Nothing you could measure, nothing you could touch. So that opened up a whole nother piece of reality for me. And being a physicist, what we do is model reality. That's what physics is.
Right.
Trying to model reality. And suddenly my reality expanded into something else.
Well, there is a lot to unpack in just that short period of time. All right, so I want to go back to you're a 7-8-year-old having these out-of-body experiences where you're an actual adult. You're being told by your guidance that there are certain things that you're going to need to hone, certain things you're going to need to master, which is, in your case, a more scientific approach to things, because you felt as if you came into this life with a predominant right brain, quote unquote, type of mentality, very imaginative. And so there's a sense of maturity and a sense of mission that seems to unfold through your younger years. Did that carry on through your teen years as well?
Yeah, well, through the teen years... that's interesting. All through my teen years, I still conversed with these guides. They didn't go away, but it was just a telepathic connection.
Yeah.
And I could get questions answered and things that I wanted to understand or know, and I could get that.
Right.
But I didn't really see that as something unique. I figured everybody did that. I didn't know that I was strange in that way.
Right.
And I kind of had the idea that it was just for me.
Right.
It wasn't for me to share.
Right.
It wasn't for me to talk about. It was just for me.
Kind of a sacred cow, right?
Yeah, I was kind of, and I don't know that anybody told me that, but that just seemed obvious to me. So I didn't really talk about it, but it was always there. So I always had this connection going, but I never thought of it as paranormal. I never thought of it as weird or strange. It just was Well, life's like that. If there's things that you don't understand and you'd like to know, well, you just ask and the answer comes.
Simultaneously, I also heard that part of your message that you got was, we're going to have to kind of tone this down, this weird metaphysical side of you, just to, bring you into the world of science, left brain, make you quote unquote normal. Probably. I mean, I'm definitely feeling a sense of mission as you speak about this.
There definitely was. Like I say, I came here to do some very specific things. And fill some roles, and I was being kind of guided to do that.
I know the feeling.
And I could more effectively do that if I wasn't someone that everybody else thought was a weirdo. I needed to have credibility.
Right.
I needed to be rational, be able to explain what I was going through and what was happening and what was doing, not just have the experience, but be able to put that experience into a context of a larger understanding so that I could explain it.
Right.
So that was important, that door got shut for a while. And I basically grew up like normal people grow up.
And a scientist.
Yeah.
Working for NASA. Yeah, everybody does that, Tom. Everybody becomes a NASA physicist.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I got going in it. And then I got out of graduate school, and I should tell you that when I got out of graduate school, I didn't have my PhD.
Okay.
I had done all the work for it. I had done the research. I had written the paper, the dissertation, which was accepted by my major professor. But at that time, there was a confluence of a couple of things happened, and that was one, I was burnt out on that. I'd been in school since I was 5 years old, and now I was, 25 or 26, late 20s. And I was done with that and wanted to get on with the rest of my life. And I had a very strong pull that I needed to leave school and be someplace else, to not just be there doing that.
Right.
Of course, I didn't know then that the other thing I needed to be doing was to connect with Bob Monroe. But that was the connection. And I was getting pushed because that connection was needed to happen it wasn't necessarily a trivial connection. And the way to make that connection, I needed to not be in graduate school. I needed to be out where that connection could take place.
But by this point in time, you had begun to study transcendental meditation just for the purpose of getting better sleep, and you found it had some problem-solving components that became useful.
Right. So
and you already had the out-of-body experience under your belt for quite a few
years. But at that time, when I was taking the meditation, I'd forgotten all about the out-of-body that I had done as a child.
Kidding, really?
Yeah, I didn't really remember it because I didn't really try. Maybe if somebody asked me, "Did you ever do a strange thing when you were young?" I maybe would have thought it and brought it back up, but it just wasn't part of my life. It wasn't necessary. It didn't fit into anything that I was doing. So it just was lying fallow there at the bottom of the barrel.
Right.
And I wasn't interacting with it. So I talked to my major professor. I thought I was going to graduate because my idea was you'd come, you do all the work, pass all the courses, pass the preliminary exams and all that stuff, and do your research and then get your PhD and go.
Right.
And my major professor said, well, I've got another research project I'd like you to do. It's very similar to the one you did, but we're going to change targets and we're going to do another one. And I was done. So I said, no, thank you.
Yeah, right.
I really want to not do another research project. I'm out of here. So I left. So I do not have a PhD degree, but I do have the education of a PhD. I've done everything that was necessary for one, except I did not do my second thesis.
I stand corrected, Dr. Campbell.
Yeah.
Almost Dr. Campbell.
Yeah. So anyhow, then within a couple of months of taking this job, which was just obviously engineered by the what do people call that? Synchronicity. It was obviously engineered because it was a time that we were in recession. We had run out of gas. I don't know if you remember the times that the gas pumps were
early, mid-1970s, right? Sure.
Yeah, that was just late 60s, early 70s. and and nobody was hiring anybody. People were having to lay off work. So I sent out 50 resumes to the world as a physicist getting a job, and only one came back, and that was one that was unsatisfactory. I really wasn't too interested in that. That was working on nuclear submarine design and building for the Navy in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And I said, no, I don't think so. That's not really what I want to do.
Okay.
And then, just out of the blue, somebody who knew somebody made a connection, so somebody else who made a connection, and I found this job that had never been advertised and never actually put out, that was looking for a physicist to do work, and that was in technical intelligence in a organization that was in the same city that I lived in. So I took that job, and I knew that was the one I was supposed to take.
Okay.
So I always was intuitive about things, even though I was left brain. I still was intuitive. And I took it at a GS5, which is basically a secretary's grade, because that was the only way they could bring me on. That was it was kind of a finagle, to get somebody who could do their work, but they really didn't have the grade structure so I said, sure, I'll come on. Yeah, this is good. So I came on, and within 2 or 3 years, my career bumped up very quickly because I was good at what I did, and pretty soon, I went from 5 to 7 to 11 to 12 to 13 up the GS level, and all that worked fine. But anyway, I was there for a decade. But about the first 2 or 3 months that I was there, my boss handed me Bob's book, Journeys Out of the Body, and he says, "Tom, what do you think of this?"
So you'd never talked with him about your
No, I never talked to
as a
anybody
kid?
about. No, I
Okay.
never talked to him about anything. Nothing. Those things were still laying at the bottom, unseen.
Right. And
at
it
that
wasn't
point.
exactly a very popular topic of conversation in the workplace back then.
No, it wasn't,
especially not
yeah.
in the government. Right.
Yeah, not in the government, not in technical circles.
Right,
These were
exactly.
all techies that I worked with. And he handed me this book, and so I read it, and I told him what I thought was, well, if this is real, then wow. Because I didn't tell him this, but because of my ability to debug my code mentally, I've been looking for ways to explore and understand and do maybe some research in this area because I wanted to understand it. So I told him that's a really big wow if this is true. But on the other hand, how do you know if the guy's not just trying to sell books, write something, some crazy stuff to sell books? So my boss and a few other people in this organization evidently had passed that book around and were interested. They found that Bob Monroe lived only about, 20 miles away. And they made an arrangement to go meet him.
Right. He was in Whistlefield in Virginia. Yeah, you were literally 20 minutes away.
20 miles, not that far away. He was just out past Crozet, Whistlefield Farms.
Right.
So they found out where he was, and they asked me, do you want to go meet Bob? And I was like, absolutely. I want to know if this guy's for real or just a hustler. So we met Bob, and he obviously was very real, and he had the mindset of an engineer. In other words, he was very straightforward and very rational and logical. So he was very easy to talk to. For me, a techie, a physicist, and talking to Bob was real easy. And he obviously was trying hard to put this thing of out of body that he had experienced kind of on some kind of rational map, understand it in a way that it made sense instead of just being a weird thing that happened to him. Absolutely. He wanted to study it and learn about it, make science out of it. So he had just built a lab, and actually it wasn't any lab yet. It was just a building, just a structure that was empty. Right. And that was his idea that was going to be a lab. And in Bob's mind, it was like that movie, build it and they will come. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew he had to start by building that lab. So he did. And myself and an electrical engineer, Dennis Mennerich, we were both in this little group that went out to meet him. And Bob said, well, we were all up on the lab, a little deck on the back of the lab. And he says, well, you guys are all, science types and techies. I just have this lab and I'd like to, do some serious study of consciousness. So, any of you interested? Mm-hmm. And of course, I was interested because I was motivated to find out something about this other realm mm-hmm. inside my head that was so good at, debugging code. Mm-hmm. What else could I do? Right. And why could I do it? And what were the limits? And all those questions were in my mind. And,
I'm laughing because I can hear him in my inner voice going, so what do you think, Sport? Does this look like fun to you?
Yeah. So myself and Dennis, who were both in there, we said we'd do it, and then we got in touch with Bob. He went out of town. We got in touch with him, started coming up to the lab. And this was early 1972.
Right.
Early in the, maybe in January, February, early 1972. And we started coming out, and it didn't take long for Bob to teach us how to go out of body on demand. So we'd come up to the lab, and maybe 6 months or a year, we'd been coming up somewhere between, 15 to 20 hours a week. So it was like a half-time job. Okay. Yeah, it wasn't just one evening in a week.
Right.
It was almost every evening in a week. Uh-huh. And we'd get there about right after dinner, like 7 o'clock, 6 or 7, and Dennis and I'd work in the lab trying to build equipment and figure out what we could do and, what were the variables and how could we isolate them and doing all of this. Then Bob would come up about 9, after a couple of hours, and then we'd talk with him for a while and we'd show him what we've done and where we were going and what we were doing. And then we all go down to Whistlefield and hang out at Bob's house until, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. And then we go home, and I'd go home, get in my bed, and start practicing all the things that I had learned at the lab that night. And I'd continue to play with him and practice him until close to the time the alarm went off, and I had to get up and go to work.
All right.
So during that time, I was only getting like 2, 3, some good days, 4 hours of sleep a night. But I was spending, hours every day, in non-physical space. So I was able to juggle both the job, and in the job, I was very productive. I was doing work that was primarily creative. It was work that nobody else could do, nobody else would do, and it needed to be done. And because I figured out how to do it, everybody just left me alone. I didn't have a lot of supervision or anything. My boss just, go do it. When you have something, let me know, kind of thing. So
right.
I was having a lot of fun because it was very unstructured. I'd get to work late. I'd usually walk in an hour late or so for work, but then I'd stay until, 6 or 7 in the evening till it was time to go out and see Bob. It was that kind of stuff.
It sounds like it was pretty relaxed. So Whistlefield was before my time. I became Bob's recording engineer in '88 and stayed with him until he passed in '95. Stayed on after that. But the lab that I had to work in was considerably more sophisticated than what you guys had at Whistlefield. You were putting it all together.
Yeah,
what type of equipment were you trying to build at that time?
Well, Bob had these 3 what he called check units, which I guess that name still carried over into yours. And one of them was a Faraday cage. It was solid sheet metal all the way around, welded.
Trying to keep EMF out of the picture.
And they were all acoustically isolated.
Right.
So we had these 3 things, and that was what we started with. And Bob had run wire to each one of the rooms, and that's about as far as he had gotten. So we had this bundle of like 5 wires or something that ran from a control room into each one of these rooms.
Right.
So we of course, first worked up a galvanic skin response thing to put on a finger.
Right.
And eventually we put an EEG in there that we...
How many channels were you working with at the time?
How many channels? What, of audio?
No, EEG.
Oh, there were... The EEG itself had, I think, 9...
Pretty primitive electrodes, right?
Yeah, electrodes that you put on into your head, and then one that went on your toe or your finger or something as a ground.
So you had GSR and EEG as a monitoring
we had those
device.
Two, and then we also had a very high impedance voltmeter. Real high impedance input voltmeter.
Right.
And we looked at that. So we had those three things going as far as monitoring the people who were in there.
What was the purpose of the voltmeter? Were you looking for the energy body or something to that effect?
No, we found some curious things with that voltmeter that people, just like in the Matrix, people make pretty decent batteries.
Right.
And,
sure.
And you could put that, and you would find potentials, across different points in the body. There'd be potentials. There'd be potentials generated.
Right. So you were looking for differentials between waking consciousness and, say, the hypnagogic state and stuff like that.
Yeah, just to see what we could see, what happened. Did those potentials go up, go down, change? And
essentially skin potential voltage.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Basically.
Yeah. And for the audience's sake, GSR is galvanic skin response. It's like a lie detector test.
Yeah, well, it basically measures your resistance to your body of electrical current flow. It's just like you put a current through your body and to see whether a lot of current or a little current flows. And basically, when you are in a very relaxed state, your body's more resistive and less current flows. When you're if you are having an anxiety attack, which I guess is at the opposite end, your body is much more conductive.
Yeah.
So it was a measure of how relaxed and what kind of states you were in relative to your awareness and how relaxed you were.
Now, did Bob have hemisync signals already pre-designed for this, or were you part of that process as well?
Hemisync didn't exist. Hemisync didn't exist yet.
Okay.
What Bob had was he had a local electrical engineer build a little box for him that basically did a surf sound.
Oh, I see.
And underneath that surf, he had a little 4 hertz modulation. So it kind of fit pretty well with the surf. So it was this, a crescendo, something we would build like surf, and then you could kind of crash. But underneath it all was this
right.
Which was the 4 hertz stuff going on underneath.
But he was using white or pink noise in order to generate that evoke
pink
potential,
noise,
right?
Yeah, pink noise was a 4 hertz background.
Right.
And he did that because he noticed a 4 hertz vibration as he exited, to go out of body. And that was the only connection to that. So he put this 4 hertz sound in there. Right. And that was his sound. And we listened just to that. And
it was very intuitive. His first experiments with all of this.
At that point, he had a Focus 10, and that was it. He'd go to 10, and it was almost out of the hypnotist's tool bag, and you'd relax your feet, relax your toes. You'd go through this whole relaxation
autogenic
thing.
Relaxation. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And then basically you'd get to 10, and you were out on your own, not go have an adventure.
Right.
So it was that sort of thing. And
so is that how he taught you, quote unquote, in Dennis to go out of body in terms of your techniques?
Yeah, basically, after Dennis and I built the GSR, got the equipment, got a rack and rack mounted stuff so we could see the tools. And, it was just a lot of infrastructure had to be built, had to be created. There was nothing there. It was an empty shell. And we got that together, hooked up these things. We didn't have the EEG at the time. We just started with galvanic skin response. Later, we added the high impedance input, the voltmeter. And then the last, we ended up with a EEG. But we had some interesting things. The galvanic skin response and the high impedance input voltmeter, both of those, when you were in a pulsation state, would sit there and do this, wobble. You could see the little needle on the galvanometer, that measures how much current's going through the circuit for the galvanic skin response. Right. And that would come down as you got more and more relaxed, and it would come down, and it would come down, and it would get right about here and start doing
modulating.
This. 4 hertz.
Right. Interesting.
4 hertz.
Yeah.
So we'd see that. And
that was a frequency following response of sorts. Sure.
Yeah. And we saw the same thing in the high impedance voltmeter. We'd see that would get to a point that it would kind of change as a person relaxed, and then it would oscillate. So we knew that 4 hertz was a key to it.
Sure.
So we tried all kinds of experimental things. Dennis and I were just cut and try, see if it worked. One experiment, I sat on a stool, and they had a big metal plate on either side of my head, probably maybe a foot square plate, and we hooked it up to a very high voltage output. It was low current, but it was huge voltage. Put, I don't know, 300,000 volts on it or some kind of thing like that, jacked up like an electric fence, kind of voltage. And
trying to create evoke potential in the temporal lobes or something?
Yeah, we were going to shake the pineal gland. We were going to take that pineal gland. If it had any charge on it at all, we were going to oscillate the electrical field back and forth at 4 hertz. And we were going to shake.
Madmen. You guys are crazy people.
Yeah, and we were going to shake that pineal gland at 4 hertz to see what happened. So, that's what you get when you have a physicist and electrical engineer.
I know, and an orchestrator like Bob Monroe.
So, Bob didn't suggest any of that. That was just stuff we came up with because we'd read books, and the books. The book said the pineal gland was something that might be connected. 4 hertz was connected. So why not shake the pineal gland at 4 hertz and see what happened?
Why not take an electrode and just jam it right in the center of your forehead?
So, this would be fine because, you would only get zapped badly if you could connect with both plates at the same time. And each one was about an inch from either ear. So if you hit one, you wouldn't hit the other one unless you really did something stupid, like turned your head sideways or put your hands up or something.
Those are some A1 safety precautions you took at the time.
Right. So no, everything was we were just kids. We were 20-something, and we were just playing and seeing what would work. So we did that. And I sat there and had my head with a really high E field oscillating at 4 hertz for probably about, 15, 20 minutes. And I wanted to see how did it affect my altered states. Because by then, Dennis and I had been through with Bob, in the booth. And I got to where I was very familiar with my altered states. And relaxation states and where you were in a theta state and in an alpha state. I knew exactly how they felt by then. I was sitting there and saying, what does this thing do? If I put myself in a theta, does it make it bigger or better, or does it change anything? What's this thing going to do? And it turns out the only thing it did is gave me a headache that lasted for about 2 to 3 weeks.
I hear you.
That's what it did. And, so that was the end of that. That didn't work. I mean, we tried everything. We built pyramid to sit in. That was a thing that was going around at that time. And we were just trying to see if we could find some way that we could actually interact with this process in a way that we could teach other people how to do it. And Dennis read and this was at work, he read an old Scientific American that was, this was now out of the late 60s by a guy named Oster.
Gerald, right.
Yeah, and he talked about binaural beats. And it entrained brainwaves. So you listen to the binaural beat and your EEG would
give you a like-kind reader
at that frequency. And so Dennis showed the article to me, and he said, let's go do it. So Dennis pilfered a signal generator out of the electrical engineering department, because he was familiar with that department. I was just out of the physics department, and that's where we got some of our tech out of their throwaway bin.
This is at UVA now?
This is at UVA.
Okay, so I've got to give a big shout out to the folks at the University of Virginia for helping to get all this moving.
So, they had kind of a throwaway bin, stuff that they had was 10 or 20 years old that they weren't using anymore, that was off to the side. And we would use some of that. And when we were done, we'd give it back to them. But they didn't mind because, the EEE department knew Dennis and the physics department knew me. And we had taught labs there and done other things. So we were able to use some of their stuff. So Dennis went in and made a binaural beat tape.
Mm-hmm.
So, and for us to just play with. Bob was gone. He was out teaching a course at, what's the place at
Esalen.
Yeah, Esalen. He was out at Esalen, and he was going to be gone for a couple of weeks. So anyway, we started listening to this binaural beat, and wow, it worked really, really well because we made it 4 hertz, of course, or 3.78, something like that.
Did you blend it with that the pink noise generator?
No, we didn't blend. We didn't.
You just went
listened
straight
to it.
sine waves.
Yeah,
Okay,
you just listen to it, and.
So just a quick disclaimer, kids, do not try this at home.
Yeah. And then we listened to it, thought, well, that has some promise. So then we started playing with it. So then Dennis procured, again, from the EE department, a signal generator that could do sine waves, sawtooth, square waves, different waveforms.
Primitive synthesizer.
And we started trying it with different waveforms. Slightly different frequencies at different amplitudes, and we just played with it for a week or so, just trying all kinds of things, and then change it, go back, get in the booth, and see how it affected our minds. Because again, this was at least a year in, so we knew how to, where our minds were and where our altered states were, and so we'd say, how did it affect us? So we were the guinea pigs,
right?
And if it affected us such that it helped drive to theta and the pulsation states and out of body, well, then that was good. If it didn't, then it wasn't good.
Right.
So after about a week and a half of trying everything we thought we had something that worked really, really well. We'd found a base frequency and around the 4 hertz, but the equipment we had was so crude that you couldn't get whatever frequency you wanted. You had to get what was the closest to what you wanted because the equipment wasn't good enough to dial up, 3 point whatever. You couldn't do any of that. It was pretty crude stuff.
And your recording devices were probably realistic, right? The old Radio Shack models.
Yeah. Bob was big into Radio Shack, and we'd go to Radio Shack and we'd buy the cheapest cassette tapes that money could buy. They'd cost like $1 a piece for a cassette tape.
I'm laughing because I'll never forget the first time I walked into the lab up at the Monroe Institute. It was literally 2x4 studs, floor to ceiling, full of Radio Shack gear. And Bob was just so proud of all of this stuff. And I was a recording engineer. I had a studio in Charlottesville. And I walked in there, and he was looking around. And he saw me looking around. He said, "So, kid, what do you think?" And I knew this guy was this was my first meeting with him. And I knew this guy was obviously very proud of his studio. And I just looked at him and said, "Is all this stuff calibrated to that recording console?" That's the only thing I could think to say. And he said, "Do you know how to do that?" And I said, "Yeah, if it's patched into the network," because he had a patched network set up there. And so he said, "Okay, do it." And I went to his mastering desk and patched a few chords together and set a 1K slate over to messed with the input and, calibrated that one. And he said, "Well, you look like you know what you're doing. You got a job." That was it. Anyway, I interrupted your story. So now you're recording primitive binaural beats using these. You had a single oscillator.
Yeah, we had an oscillator that maybe we had, I can't, this is a long, long time ago, back in the 70s. We had an old one that would only step like 4 or 5 hertz at a time, or maybe 10 hertz at a time. Right. And then we had I don't know whether we had to record it twice in order to get the two that would then interplay with each other, but it was very, very crude.
Archaic.
Yeah, very archaic. It was another decade before that equipment became more, more accurate and more adjustable and so on. 1970 was still, the electronics there were out of the middle 60s.
Right.
And when you go through Radio Shack, you don't get stuff that's at the top end. So it was,
all the Radio Shack enthusiasts out there.
Yeah, it was what we had. And so anyway, so that's that was kind of the equipment that we were working with. And we made these binaural beats, and they worked pretty well. We played with them to optimize them. And we had something that was pretty well optimized for the various frequencies, and as best as we could jury-rig the beat frequency.
Right.
And we told Bob when he came back, from his trip, we said, "Hey, we found something that's really interesting. You should listen to this." And he did. And wow, he was really impressed. And then we started to bring people in and have them listen to it. And we found out that almost everybody ended up in an altered state, like they'd been meditating for the last 10 years. It just really put people in that state and held them there. And, we put our own wives and children in there. We got anybody who came to visit Bob, they were always run up to the lab and we'd slap the headphones on them. And we basically just wanted to give it to naive subjects and see what did it do for them.
Right.
We didn't lead them. We just said, here, listen to this, and then later we'll ask you about it.
Pure science, but weird science. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really the beginning of the idea of TMI, because eventually we had, over probably the next year or two, we've run maybe a couple of hundred people through there, and it obviously worked.
Right.
So at that point, Bob started making tapes with that as the background, with the binaural beat running in the background underneath his regular surf with the 4 hertz stuff in it. So he added the binaural beats to it, and then he let his friends know that he had a technology that would kind of push them up to the spot where out of body happened. And that was the very first training course that we gave, and it was in the old Tuckahoe Motel, just as you start up the mountain on 250.
Right.
And Bob went in there with his cable company and wired it so that they didn't have a whole lot of business. That motel was kind of at its tail end of its life expectancy.
Right.
And so they didn't mind that we put holes, in their ceilings and things, because we filled it up. We filled it up for them regularly. Anyhow, that's kind of where the idea came, and people came, and we filled that motel up, which means we had about 20 rooms with a couple of people in each room, and all sorts of paranormal things happening. All sorts of phenomena just were springing up all over the place, and it was such a big success that the word spread through the community, and everybody that Bob knew and the people that Bob didn't know but knew some of the people who had come, and everybody wanted to come and try that next technology. And that's when Bob, the businessman, said, "Oh, I think there's enough interest here to make a business out of this."
Right.
And that's where the idea came for TMI. And it was probably 2 or 3 years later that he got the new land, as it was called, and where TMI is located now. And then he shifted over there, built a facility, and that's somewhere after that's when you came in. When that was,
I came in '88. But I'm much more interested in your era, because by the time I got there, you were already a legend. Scooter was running the place. Yeah. And she had worked with you and Dennis, and you obviously were involved in the creation of the first programs and stuff. And, you and I had never met up to that point where we met at Unity. And I thought, this is odd, because this is a name I've heard, throughout my professional career. And, this is the first time I'm meeting you. Anyway, we could talk about the old days forever. I'm very interested in your story, though. You and Dennis are trying to find some kind of evidence for the phenomenon that you're working with Bob. And he brought you into a space of deeper inquiry, is my understanding, while you're looking for the mechanisms behind the phenomenon, things like psi functioning. So you're a curious, young physicist. You and Dennis is a curious young engineer. You both have some interest in psi. You meet up with this guy who has out-of-body experiences. You've read his book. You're playing around with him in his lab. You're helping him create his initial frequencies and stuff. What was your purpose at that point in time? I know Bob's purpose in getting involved in all this stuff was to try to find some kind of mechanism where he could control his out-of-body experiences initially. He was looking for some kind of answers as to why he was having these spontaneous experiences. You had already had a few of these experiences. Dennis, I'm assuming, perhaps had some experiences? Yes?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Dennis had experiences. He probably got to the out-of-body about 3 or 4 months ahead of me. He was a little quicker than I was.
But you had been having them as a child, so
yeah,
for you it was like remembering.
Them as a child. But then when they started coming back, actually I'd been there, and I was going out of body with Bob, and we were going down to Bob's house every evening and staying up till past midnight. And at one of these times down at his house, Bob was telling me about a test that he had just been given, an experience that he'd been given. And it just happened to him that previous night, just last night. And he was telling me about it because he'd talk about the things that he got, as he got things that interested him. He'd share that with Dennis and I because we were all just this group that was working on this stuff. So we were down at Whistlefield Farm sitting in a little parlor that he had. And he said, let me tell you about the thing I did last night. Mm-hmm. And he started out telling me about this first test question and what it was and how he had answered it. Mm-hmm. And that triggered that memory that was lying down at the bottom of my intellectual barrel. It was that because I had no use for it, that triggered that. Memory came back up. Oh. And then he told me the second thing, and that pulled it even more. And I said, Bob, wait a minute. And I took about 2 minutes, and I said, all right. And the third thing was this. And I told him, and his jaw dropped down, and he looked at me like, were you there? And I said, no, I've done this when I was 7 years old. Right. I took the same set of tests. And then I said, and then the fourth one was this. Right. And it was exactly right. So then he told me, the fifth one, and we went on till we got to the last test where it was the end of it for both of us. That's where the thing ended. And the way these things usually work is you keep getting another question until you get one wrong or until the test's over, one of those two things. And I didn't know in this case whether we both got the same one wrong or whether that was just the end of the test. This was a standardized test that I had been given 20 years earlier that Bob was just given that night, and it was identical. And since then, I've run into 2 or 3 other people who have had, experiences that were obviously meant to learn something and meant to test a person's reaction and fear and so on, that other people have had identical experiences to mine.
You're talking about non-physical tests that are happening as a result of meeting with specific people, entities, whatever we want to call them, who are trying to help you in your personal evolution as you grow. And in order to get to it in the next level, you have to sort of master these skills before you get there.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that was when it all came back. So at that point, when I was saying all this stuff came back, then over the next 15 or 20 minutes, all of my out of body when I was 7 years old, learning the entities, what they said, what I did, all of that stuff then just came back in a rush.
Right.
Because it was always there. It just, I didn't have any use for it. It was just stuff that happened. And
plus you were mastering that whole left brain scientific thing.
I was mastering that left brain thing. So.
Right. Whereas Bob didn't have to worry about all of that. Bob was an artist, and he did have an engineering background, but he was predominantly a storyteller, and he was a very curious person.
Yeah.
And so when this happened for him, these out-of-body experiences, he just went with it. I mean, as an artist, that's where he and I connected. We're both artistic and engineering types, in terms of recording and production and stuff like that. That was his big thing.
Better yet, he went with it and he kept a journal.
That's right.
That was important. And he kept a journal. And basically his first book was just that journal.
Yeah.
That he had kept.
A lot of people don't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's true. Yeah.
That was his first book. It was that journal that he kept. So anyway, so then it all came back. And then I had all those memories back from the very beginning. And anyhow, we were Bob and Dennis and I were kind of a team that worked together, at least 3 or 4 nights a week and weekends for 5-6 years, something like that.
Uh-huh.
And then once we found the binaural beats and Bob added it to his sound, that worked so well that we became trainers.
Right.
And Nancy Lee, by this time, had graduated from college, and she came back, so she worked with us.
Right.
I called her Nancy Lee Scooter is what everybody called her.
Nancy Lee Scooter.
I called her Nancy Lee.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so then we worked together. So we'd be about once a month, we would be off, Nancy Lee and I, or Nancy Lee and Dennis, because Nancy Lee was permanent. She was doing that. Dennis and I not only had jobs, but we had families. We had wives and children to take care of and other things to do. So we'd kind of alternate with it, but we'd go out with Nancy Lee to various places and give courses.
And all of this was happening just prior to what's the now famous and declassified interaction between Bob and the CIA and DIA, et cetera.
Yeah, it was just before that happened.
Right.
That hadn't really happened yet. There was some interest of the CIA in Bob's work, but it wasn't really, hadn't really come to a head yet. They were just kind of snooping around to see if there's really something there that they should be interested in.
Right.
And that was about all it was. It was after I was gone because I didn't want to be a trainer. Trainer took too much time. And, between my job and my family, I couldn't do that much.
Right.
So Dennis and I both kind of said, we'll train your trainers, but, we got to go home.
Right.
So that's when I stopped going out to Whistlefield a lot. But that's when TMI was born then.
Right. Exactly.
And within another year or two, he had the new land and he built the buildings and all that.
Met up with Russell Targ and got involved in all of that.
Yeah, all of that sort of happened. And then there was connection with CIA and others would come and took some of his courses and that sort of thing. But that was after Dennis and I had kind of moved on.
So you didn't get involved in that whole remote viewing training?
No, I didn't. That was after I had gone. So I didn't get involved in that at all.
And it just gets better from here. But I'm going to put a pin in the conversation just to give you time to digest what's been said thus far, because in the next episodes, we go deeply down the rabbit hole of reality. So tune in next time when we release the rest of this conversation. I'm off for some summer R&R, so until we meet again, I wish you all peace on your journey and look forward to what comes next. Stay curious. And as always, thanks for listening.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.